CHAPTER IV, Part II, of the Life Story of a Russian Exile, by Marie Sukloff, translated by Gregory Yaros. This recording is in the public domain. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. CHAPTER IV, Part II, Section 3. The Volos scribe was an intelligent and kind man, and he openly showed his sympathy with me. I made up my mind to ask him to get from the uryadnik permission for me to go to Kansk. I hoped to find there comrades who would help me with money and a passport. "Yes," said the scribe in answer to my request, "I can get for you the desired permission. But if you should run away, the responsibility would fall upon me, because I am sure the uryadnik will prove in some way or other that I conspired with you. You know that I am the father of 4 children," he went on, "but if you give me your word of honor that you will return, I will persuade the uryadnik to let you go to Kansk for a few days." His proposal was difficult for me to accept. If I should give him my word of honor, I would have to return, and my only aim in asking for leave was to escape. For 2 days I went about trying to find a way out of the difficulty, but finally decided to agree to his condition. It was absolutely necessary to go to Kansk and procure money and a passport, without which I could not even think of escaping. We went to the uryadnik, and after considerable questioning he consented to let me go to Kansk for a few days. On the 1st of February, 1905, I left the village, riding in the cart of a peasant who was going to town on business. I had no addresses, and did not even know if there were any political exiles in Kansk. The peasants of Alexandrovskoye had assured me that there were many nobles there. As I found later, the politicals were known there as nobles. After 2 days' travel, we reached Kansk. For the sum of 2 kopecks, a ragged boy drove me to the blacksmith's shop. A tall man in a blue blouse, his hands and face covered with soot, greeted me with a cordial smile. I told him my name, and he led me to his house. There I was met by a pale, frail-looking young woman who held a sickly baby wrapped in rags. Having overcome the feeling of embarrassment I experienced at the sight of their wretched poverty, I told them the object of my visit. "I am very sorry," said Mr. M., the blacksmith, "but I don't think you will get anything in this town. There are only 6 politicals here, and they are all starving. The only thing we can do for you is to give you letters of recommendation to our Irkutsk people. There are a great many of them there, and they will surely help you." A few hours later, the whole exile colony of Kansk gathered at the house of Mr. M. They held a consultation and decided that I must go directly to Irkutsk. They brought me a railroad ticket to that city out of their last money, and that very evening I boarded a train, carrying in my pocket a letter of recommendation. As I was dressed in a mixture of civil and convict garb, the passengers stared at me, and I did not feel quite at ease. After 2 days' travel, I came to Irkutsk. When the cab stopped in front of a rich house on the main street of the city, I hesitated for a few seconds. What if they will not let me in? I rang the bell. A beautiful young girl opened the door. I handed her the letter of recommendation, and she invited me to sit in the waiting room. Directly, an old man of short stature entered. He asked me who I was and what I wanted. Having convinced himself that I really was the person I claimed to be, he shook my hand and invited me to meet his wife and children. This man, Mr. K., was an old revolutionist, exiled to Irkutsk many years before, but notwithstanding his past, he now held a high government position. That same day he handed me 100 rubles and a passport on which he wrote in his own hand that I was a merchant's daughter. Such a passport was as good as a real one in Siberia, because the Pristovs and the uryadniks who endorse them are so ignorant that they can hardly read Russian. Mrs. K. helped me put on her daughter's clothes and presented a watch to me. In short, I was made unrecognizable. It was necessary to return to Alexandrovskoye. I knew that the scribe would feel uneasy about my long absence. I did not want to think how I would escape after my return. The difficulties seemed insurmountable, but I had given my word of honor and had to return. With sorrow in my heart, I bade good by to those kind people. One of Mr. K.'s sons went with me to Kansk, as they were afraid that I might be arrested on the road. In the railway compartment, we traveled in the second class, were two army officers. They made friends with my companion and treated him to vodka and cigars. There was nothing in their appearance to arouse our suspicions. When night came, I lay down on my cot. I could not sleep. The thought that I was going back to that lonely village would not let me rest. Suddenly I felt that somebody was tugging at the chain which supported my watch. I opened my eyes, and to my great terror saw the same officer who had been so amiable with me several hours before. In one hand he held my bag, which contained the 100 rubles and the passport. I emitted a terrible shriek. The officer seized me by the throat and began to choke me. I became unconscious. When I had regained consciousness, my first thought was that the money and passport were gone. I heard people talking near me, but had no desire to look at them. Why didn't they let me die? I thought. What will I do without the money and the passport? I could not move my head, and the fingers still seemed to be choking me. At the first station I was carried into the gendarme office. The two officers were already there. They turned out to be escaped Sakhalin convicts masquerading as army officers. "Why did you want to kill me?" I asked my assailant. "Didn't you see that I am not rich?" "Why did you cry out?" was his reply. "I had to save myself. After all, I did not choke you to death." The bag with the money and the passport was returned to me. I owed my life to Mr. K 's son, who was the first to reach my side when the robber choked me. After an absence of 10 days, I returned to Alexandrovskoye. The scribe and the uryadnik were delighted to see me. "And we already thought that you would not come back," said the uryadnik, smiling. IV. The question how to escape did not leave me for a moment. The only people from whom I hoped to get the necessary information were the Orloffs, who lived in the village of Ribinskoye, the nearest to ours, and I decided to make my way in that direction. I was afraid to ask the peasants for aid, notwithstanding their sympathetic attitude. Besides, I knew that if the authorities found out that somebody had driven me to Ribinskoye, the poor peasants would be held responsible for my escape. There was one way left to me, and that was to walk the distance of 28 miles which separated the two villages. The road to Ribinskoye I knew well enough. On the second day after my return from Irkutsk, I got up at daybreak, dressed as warmly as I could, and with a few pieces of bread tied in a handkerchief, set out in the direction of Ribinskoye. The whole village was fast asleep, but the very huts seemed to watch my steps. Every sound made my heart beat faster, and I looked around, expecting to see somebody running in pursuit. Soon I came to the end of the village. The smooth, silvery road stretched before me. I straightened up, drew a full breath of clear, frosty air, and quickened my pace. My fear had disappeared. Calmly I looked at the snow-covered forest which stood on both sides of the road, and I walked faster and faster, dreaming of freedom for myself and my country. I don't know how long I walked thus. I only remember that a sharp pang of hunger interrupted my dreams, and I began to consume one piece of bread after another without slackening my pace. Suddenly I heard the clatter of horses' hoofs behind me. Without stopping to think for a second, I turned to the forest, but the sleigh was near me before I had time to get under the cover of the trees. "Where are you going?" a voice called to me. I turned around. It was a peasant who lived in a neighboring village. He knew me well. "I am going to Ribinskoye," I replied indifferently, "and have no money to hire a sleigh." "Get in," he said. "I am going there too, and will give you a lift." A few hours later I was at the house of the Orloffs. The tiny arms of their child embraced me. "I won't let you go away from us no more," he said, patting my cheek. The cold in the house was fearful. The wretched poverty in which the Orloffs lived astonished even me. A rickety table, two broken chairs, and an ancient wooden bed, which squeaked and lurched every time one sat down on it, made up all their possessions. When I told them that I had decided to escape, they were glad for me. "I don't see how we can live here," said Mrs. Orloff. "The child is growing. He will soon be 3 years old. We cannot earn anything here. The money which I get from home is hardly sufficient to pay rent and buy firewood." She looked haggard and worn, and it seemed to me that tuberculosis had already laid its stamp on her beautiful face. Mr. Orloff hastened to change the conversation. "Yes," he said, "now, after the Bloody Sunday, we must give up the delusion that we can bring about better conditions by peaceful propaganda. We must fight tyranny with its own weapons. Such outrages of the government can be responded to only by bombs and bullets. Eh, if we could only get out of here!" He paced the room, hardly able to control his emotion. "How can you escape with the child?" I said. "You will be recognized immediately." "Yes, this is the only thing which keeps us back," answered Orloff dejectedly. I looked sorrowfully at these young people who were deprived of everything in life, and whose only child hindered them from making an attempt to regain their freedom. A slow death from hunger and cold awaited them. I looked at the innocent little child who was slowly wasting away before the very eyes of his parents, and a happy thought struck me. "Listen." I turned to the Orloffs. "I will take your child with me, and you will escape later. The police will look for me alone and for you with a child, and this change of parts will save us all." For a moment their sad faces brightened with hope. "Borya," I said to the boy, "do you want to go to Grandma with me?" "Yes, I do," he replied with a determined look. "I shall go, and Mama shall go, and Papa shall go. I don't want to be here. It's cold here." In a few hours the affair was settled. I was to take the child to its grandparents in Vilna, and the Orloffs were to escape after receiving word from me that everything was all right. In the evening Mr. Orloff found a peasant who agreed to drive me to the next village, a distance of 40 miles, for 3 rubles. The following day we spent in making warm clothes for the child and preparing for the long journey. As soon as it grew dark, the driver came to call me. The mother embraced her child and me for the last time. "I entrust him to you," she said, weeping bitterly. "He is all I have in this life." "Mamochka, don't cry. I don't want you to cry. Better come with me to Grandma. I don't want to leave you here." He brought his mother's coat and tried to put it on her. Hurry up," urged the driver. Mr. Orloff took the child in his arms, kissed his weeping wife, and we went out. The night was still and cold. Heaps of snow covered the ground. We walked rapidly, and the frost squeaked under our feet. At the end of the village stood our sleigh. The horses impatiently dug the snow with their hoofs. I sat down, Mr. Orloff put the child in my lap, kissed him once more, gave my hand a tight squeeze, and we started. The sleigh glided swiftly over the smooth road. The horses ran, and the driver hummed a tune. I pressed the child in my bosom and listened to his regular breathing. Soon the driver got out of the sleigh and ran alongside the horses, trying to warm himself. I did not move, being afraid to disturb the child, who was sound asleep. At 4 o'clock in the morning we arrived in the village and knocked on the door of a peasant hut. We were admitted. To all questions where I came from and where I was going, I replied in a plaintive voice that the child had been left an orphan, and I was taking him to his grandparents in Russia. After an hour's stay in the hut, during which I warmed my frozen limbs and fed the child, I decided to go farther. My plan was to drive as far as Krasnoyarsk, to hide in that city so long as it was necessary for the hue and cry caused by my escape to subside, and then proceed to Vilna by railroad. My host readily consented to take me to the next village. "Give me 3 rubles and I'll drive fast," he said. At 6 o'clock I sat again with the child in my lap, and we renewed our journey over the endless road which ran through the Siberian taiga. In the afternoon we came to the village. From there an old peasant drove me farther. He charged me only 1 ruble, saying that I was going far and needed the money. For 2 days and 3 nights we rode thus, stopping only to warm ourselves and change horses. I hardly slept all this time. Sitting in the sleigh and listening to the roar of the wind in the taiga, I wondered if we would ever reach Krasnoyarsk alive. In the morning of the 3rd day the child became sick. He cried, and complained of pain in his body. The severe cold, lack of warm food, and constant sitting in the sleigh had proved too much for him. I had to stop for a whole day. My anxiety knew no bounds. To the worry over the child's sickness was added the fear that the police might overtake me. Toward evening the child felt better, and we set out again. At last there remained only about 10 miles to Krasnoyarsk. I was beginning to think myself out of danger when in the middle of the day, on the road to Krasnoyarsk, I heard behind me the voice of our uryadnik. "Stop! Stop! Whom are you driving?" he shouted to my driver. My blood grew cold. Instinctively I hid my face behind the child's back. I heard the footsteps of people near me, but saw nothing. " A woman with a child," said one of them. " Go ahead." I hugged and kissed the child, who had saved me from certain arrest. I promised the driver drink money, and he let the horses go at full gallop. Finally we arrived at Krasnoyarsk and stopped at a hotel. I felt sick. All my body was aching from the long ride. The child had grown terribly thin, and his dear little face showed traces of hunger and cold. Both of us needed a good rest, but I had spent more money than I had intended, and owing to lack of funds I could not stop at Krasnoyarsk for long. Having paid all the money I had for a second-class railroad ticket to Vilna, I left the city after a 24 hours' stay at the hotel. The long journey from Krasnoyarsk to Vilna passed without any serious incidents. The child proved the best protection from the searching eyes of the police and gendarmes. The spies, who swarmed at every big station, did not pay the least attention to me. They evidently could not think of such a combination. When we came to Chelyabinsk, the borderline between Siberia and European Russia, and had to change trains, our car was suddenly locked, and the passengers were let out singly and their passports examined. I held the child in my arms, and the gendarmes passed me without a question. On the 5th of March I came to Vilna and delivered the child to its grandparents. I sent a telegraphic message to the Orloffs telling them that their child was safe. Being only a short distance from my home, I decided to see my parents. I ran a terrible risk, as my parents must have been shadowed by the secret police, but my love for them proved stronger than all considerations of prudence and safety. That very day I dispatched a comrade with a letter to my parents, and in the evening they came to me. The joy of our meeting seemed to make us forget all the past sorrows and sufferings. " I will not give you any more to them," mother repeated over and again, without even attempting to dry the tears which ran in streams down her face. Father took out 50 rubles and said to me, " This money I borrowed. Take it and go abroad. There you will be safe from all the horrors which you have lived through." " Father, I cannot do that. The thing which was done to me and thousands of others cannot go unpunished. I cannot let it go." My father took my head in his hands and looked with his soft eyes straight into mine. " Oh, God, what have they made of you? You do not even cry, and there is so much hatred in your eyes, even at the sight of your old parents." " I cannot, I cannot," I kept saying. The hands of my father tenderly pressed me closer and closer to his breast. " Look," he said with tears in his voice, " how gray the 3 years of your imprisonment have made me. What will become of us if you are imprisoned again? "" Father, dear father, listen to me. It is beyond my strength to endure the suffering and persecution to which you and millions like you are subjected. I cannot bear it. And to put an end to it we must be strong and must fight. I will go and kill the murderers and tyrants, and hundreds will follow my example. And if I die " My father drew back and stood staring at me in speechless terror. My mother ceased crying. Unable to stand the ordeal any longer, I threw myself on the bed, hid my face in a pillow, and wept for a long, long time, sobbing like a child. On the next day father and mother went to the railroad station to see me off. I boarded a train for Minsk. From there a Jewish contrabandist directed me to the Austrian border. After hiding for 3 days in a small frontier town, I safely crossed the border into Brody. End of Chapter 4. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine.